My title today is from a book by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. It's called Active Hope. For those who are not familiar, I thought it might be best to start off with a summary statement in Joanna's words. Trusting the Spiral, chapter 2 of the book. One page I will read to you. Active hope is not wishful thinking. Active hope is not waiting to be rescued by the Lone Ranger or some savior from another millennium. Active hope is waking up to the beauty of life on whose behalf we can act. We belong to this world, and the web of life is calling us forth at this time. We've come a long way, but we're here to play a part, our part. With active hope, we can realize that there are adventures in store, strength to discover, and comrades to link arms with. Active hope is a readiness to engage. Active hope is a readiness to discover the strengths in ourselves and in others, a readiness to discover the reasons for hope and the occasions for love, a readiness to discover the size and strength of our hearts, our quickness of mind, our steadiness of purpose, our own authority, our love for all life, the liveliness of our curiosity, the unsuspected deep well of patience and diligence, the keenness of our senses, and our capacity to lead. But none of these can be discovered in an armchair or without any risk to ourselves. The reason I was drawn to this book. It's, I think, number 12 in a series of books that Joanna Macy has produced over the years. And the reason I'm drawn to Joanna Macy is that she was one of our instructors at the seminary in California. At the time, I was middle-aged, about 44, and I thought she was quite aged at 64. But now she's 95 and I'm 75, and she still seems quite old to me. But I also am obviously aging as well as I can. But I've been following her work for those 30 years. It's been really helpful in shaping my thinking around climate and systems change. Joanna is the author of at least that dozen books that I know about. But she's a Buddhist teacher and practitioner, and she has led workshops throughout her life around the world, helping others to work through their grief about the state of the world and trying to turn that into hope and action. So those books have been important to a lot of people. I remember 30 years ago when she told us about her experiences in Chernobyl, after the terrible nuclear accident at the power plant in what became Ukraine, what was then part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But what she did there was to help people through their grief about losing their homes and losing many of them facing radiation poison over the next several years of their lives. Cancers of all kinds, but it was absolutely a tragic time for those folks, and she was there to help them through that. But I also recently heard about a new podcast which features Joanna and a friend, a younger collaborator named Jessica Sarante, who has worked alongside her for many years. This is like a passing of an intergenerational baton, as those two women tried to hold open space for vulnerable conversations about the future of our planet. Joanna at the sunset of her time on Earth, and this young woman poised to pick up right where Joanna is leaving off. The second episode, titled The Three Stories of Our Time, spoke to many people, but I want to focus this little review today with you on the piece on some of the ideas introduced in that podcast. In that episode, those two women discuss the foundational element of Joanna's work. The three dominant stories that Joanna says are circulating in our world today. The first story, she says, is business as usual. This would chronicle the growth of the industrial economy that continues. It seems to be the dominant paradigm in the current administration at the federal level. That we must continue growing at all costs, that we don't need to sacrifice our affluent lifestyles and comfort, that we must look forward to technology to fix whatever problems are arising because of that. So the theory would be that the effects on the climate must be temporary. It's a dominant story of economists, politicians, and much of the media. It's hard to imagine futures other than the one that seems to be underway. But there's a second story, what Joanna calls the great unraveling, the story that has been told by climate scientists, by many journalists, those who blow the whistle on business as usual. It tells the story of the collapse of our ecosystems, the devastation of our soil, the warming of the atmosphere and oceans. It warns that there may be a collapse in the Earth's ability to sustain life as we know it. Joanna says, I like the term unraveling because systems just don't fall over dead immediately. They fray, progressively losing their coherence, their integrity. And that's what this great unraveling story chronicles, the fraying of the world. We all know this story, but many of us don't know how to contend with it because it carries with it some degree of grief, paralysis, and perhaps hopelessness. But the third story, which is the focus of Joanna's work for over 40 years, is called The Great Turning. The story that charts the way toward life-sustaining stories and life-sustaining society. She has called it the great adventure of our time. Certain pockets around the world, it is well underway, but often at a local or grassroots level, not at the national level, because some people are finding new ways of living with one another and with the earth in mind. Joanna says she believes this moment of transition is on the same magnitude as the shift from the hunter-gatherer societies of pre-civilization to the agricultural societies, a hinge moment in history, something to hope for. But it would also involve a large-scale shift in our collective consciousness from seeing the universe as something outside of ourselves and thinking of ourselves as isolated, atomized, separate individuals towards viewing a whole and conscious ecosystem. It would also involve the shift to viewing the world as something we are fundamentally a part of, something that lives within us as we live within it. It's a story of reconnection, of changing course from the path we are currently on towards something significantly different. Well, if we choose to accept and pursue business as usual, or the great unraveling, those two stories, then that would mean it would happen at the expense of the great turning. But the reality is that all three of these stories must unfold at the same time on different scales. Our world is far too complicated for one story to eclipse all others. And so we know that some degree of business as usual will continue for several years at least. We likely won't see some kind of dramatic fall of our entire economic system and all of our current institutions suddenly replaced by something completely and dramatically different. So the great unraveling will be playing out at other scales. We are seeing devastation of aspects of our environments. There is loss of life, both human and non-human. Some of that may have been manifest in the COVID epidemic. that we saw millions of people dying from tiny microscopic life forms we call viruses. We won't get out of this unscathed. The increasing temperature that we know was already miserable 50 years ago in Houston is getting hotter, more humid, more storms. But eventually, the great turning must unfold at a different scale. Human beings will have to come together, creatively contributing in their own ways to the creation of life-sustaining society. If it is clear that the alternative is extinction, maybe we'll get around to start changing things. Some of us thought we were on that road 15, 20 years ago, but things have come in circles and cycles, and we see the pendulum of who's dominant in what aspect of government, what aspect of environmental consciousness. So the question is how we will work within all of these stories. Most of us cannot escape those realities of business as usual entirely by moving to some dreamlike, faraway eco-commune cut off from civilization. Those islands of calm and truth and justice are not easy, and all of us can't go there, even if there were such a place. But we also must contend with the grief and suffering that is being uncovered by the great unraveling. And we must accept rather than ignore the realities of the world as we live it right now. So, if we desire the creation of a truly ecological life and a sustaining world, we must figure out how to dedicate at least some of the energy of our lives, and those of our children and grandchildren, to bringing about a raised consciousness about the necessity for a great turning. We have to exist in all of those stories at once without getting lost in the first two. Let me check the time here. I don't want to keep you late. I know you have important things to do on a Sunday afternoon. Myself, I take a nap after lunch. But they used to say, and this is some writings by a really brilliant commentator named Rebecca Solnit, who's written some meditations. They're called Meditations in an Emergency. This particular piece was written on March 1st. They used to say war is how Americans learn geography. The current civil war we are experiencing in the new administration is laying waste to many federal institutions. And that is how Americans are going to learn what their federal government really has been doing when we have less of it. I'm aware that many of the bad things of the federal government has done. And since the 1980s, some of us have protested some of those actions. The left, which is where I customarily reside, has done a very good job of talking about those problems throughout my lifetime. While the right wing, especially since 1980 when Ronald Reagan took over, they pretended that government was bloated bureaucracy, spinning its wheels and rewarding the undeserving. There's a character with 4 letters in his name who is pursuing a destruction phase right now as a right-wing trope. But people routinely overestimate the percent of the federal government spent on foreign aid and aid to the poor as compared with how much money we are devoting to what's called defense. In the past and in the current environment, it's uncool to sing the government's praises, and that made the government an easy target for the current attack. But the federal government is also scientists and weather information scientists who produce information that helps farmers, fishermen, outdoor recreation, and public safety. The federal government also prevents and manages diseases, not only here but around the world, to defend Americans as well. The federal government funds research on climate change and human health and everything else. The federal government is a lot of things and a lot of people inside the country and around the world. But most of them, these past 2 months, have been radically destabilized and demoralized and now live in fear of losing their jobs if they still have them at all. And they've lost colleagues, been given orders to participate in what seems to be destruction without thought, without planning, and corruption by people who will benefit by outsourcing things that the federal government has been doing. So we're watching psychological warfare against the workforce that has been committed to furthering the lives of other people. Well, Woody Guthrie sang, "Some will rob you with a six-gun, and some will rob you with a fountain pen." So you might see this as robbery by executive order and by hijacking by an unelected dictator. Their hands won't have literal blood on them, but the violence is clear. But if war is how Americans learn geography, then maybe we could say that political upheaval is how people learn history, as we are learning the lesson that a nation can change suddenly in both the best and in the worst ways. Most nations on earth, unlike the American system, have a recent collective memory of invasion, revolution, decolonization, or coup within the last 100 years. Their people, as through their children or their grandchildren, still live with the awareness that things do change suddenly, whether it be for the better or the worse. And that if they live in a decent democracy, they still need to protect against its loss. Some say, and Rebecca Solnit says, that's a lesson that we seem to have lost track of, that we've forgotten in this country, which has gone through almost 2 centuries without this kind of upheaval since our Civil War of the 1860s. So many of us have a "it can't happen here" mentality, but many of us are now anxious that it might. So if we are either complacent or despondent about the idea of radical change, we have to understand that mainstream narratives have disempowered us when they portray power as something possessed by a small elite, and change is something handed down from somewhere else. So when they depict ordinary people organizing for change as foolish rabble or annoying interference, we have to dismiss that perspective and say that's not what needs to happen now. Because you might agree that we're actually in an emergency now. And for some of us, the urgent question is, what can we do about it? And the short answer always was, and should always be, we can do a lot. And just as a previous president recruited European support for Ukraine, the new administration's abuse of power and destructiveness is recruiting Americans to opposition. Well, what's on my personal desktop for the next few months? Well, first, on April 5th, there will be a major national protest at many city halls around the country and in Washington. A march on April 5th. You may want to put it on your calendar if you're upset, if you think you want to be involved. You can sit on a wall at City Hall if it's not raining too hard. If the temperature's not over 95, you might actually survive it. Having 2 or 3 hours around City Hall, whether it's in Houston or one of the other small cities around. There's also a relatively routine Tesla takedown protests at Tesla sales rooms across the country. There's one on West Alabama in sort of the US 59 corridor there, Upper Kirby. There's another one out in Sugar Land someplace. If you happen to want to show up, please don't paint on the cars. Please don't throw firebombs. Just stand and witness. Indivisible is running the April 5th protest. That's an organization which was founded by 2 former congressional aides in the aftermath of the 2016 election. And they're forming hundreds of new chapters, which you can sort of look into if you want online to see if that's something you might be interested in. Also, for those of us in the room who have an accumulation of years, there's something called Third Act, a climate and democracy group Bill McKibben founded a few years ago to orchestrate the power of people who happen to be over 60 years old to do good work. But in addition to these protests by particular organizations, there are independent protests in many places by, among others, the group called 5051. But I share the feeling that many of you may feel that it's not enough. Of course it's not enough, but it's a beginning that we might choose to build on. No one knows what will happen in this perhaps suddenly destabilized country. But we do know we can choose to have a role in what happens. And maybe it's possible we can determine what will happen. But the quotation is, don't ask what will happen, be what will happen. To be what happens means that millions of us need to start organizing more effectively, to gather up our friends, to form affinity groups, joining organizations or actions that you agree with, or a handful of people just coming together with signs on a particular day in a particular place can have some impact. Maybe not much, but it's ripples and ripples that grow. So speaking up is part of building momentum with your elected officials, in letters to the newspaper, online, and conversations with people you know, your neighbors. If you speak up to affirm human rights and the rule of law, the value of the Weather Bureau and the FAA and the federal institutions that have been under attack, you can speak up against corruption and destruction of systems that are needed for our people. If we use our voices to avoid normalization or forgetting what's going on, we don't have to accept this lying down. And we do have at least some power. But the most important elements are courage and hope, which can be as contagious as their opposites of fear and despair. So, as Rebecca Solnit says, if the idiots in charge are crashing the economy, even people who are comfortable and consider themselves safe, we can be affected and impacted in very negative ways. Many of those who formerly supported the administration or stood by silently and ignored politics are beginning to feel it. To people they know, to services that they depend on, and we must make choices about whether to recruit or revile them. In other words, don't push people away. Find ways to include people in saying that this is going too far, too fast, and recklessly. In a sense, the breadth of the attack we are witnessing is offering a possibility for broader coalitions if we build them. So, I have charged the congregation that I serve more regularly at Thoreau, and I would ask you today, are you ready to say that line from the movie called Network? We're mad as hell and we don't want to take it anymore. Can you say that? We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. If you believe that, then maybe you can act with these other groups. Great uprisings are often both carefully prepared for, but also essentially unpredictable. It's as if the fuel has been gathering for a bonfire, but suddenly a lightning strike ignites it. We can gather the wood, but we can't predict the lightning. But perhaps, if there are enough of us, we can be the lightning. Living in democracy is about recognizing that our own point of view won't always win out, but we must continue to fight for whatever change we really believe in. The change we seek, the change we need, will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. Don't wait for the next election. Go out and make a difference right now. Because through your action, you will fill others with hope. And you might just fill yourself with hope. I have another short reading from the Active Hope book, which originally was titled 20 years ago, How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power. But originally it was How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And here's the short quote. When you act on behalf of something greater than yourself, you begin to feel it acting through you with a power that is greater than your own. As we take risks for the sake of something greater than our separate individual lives, we can feel graced by other beings and by the earth itself. Those with whom and on whose behalf we act can give us strength, a degree of eloquence, and staying power that we didn't know we had. We just need to practice knowing that and remembering that we are sustained by each other in the web of life. Our true power comes as a gift, like grace, because it is truth, it is sustained by others. If we practice drawing on the wisdom and beauty and strengths of our fellow humans and our fellow species, we can go into any situation and trust that the courage and intelligence required will be supplied. As one of my other instructors in seminary assured us, with the right motivation, with compassion, and with love, you can be enough to make a difference. Thank you for your attention this morning.